Now recognize the ranking member.
Again, let me thank each witness for their testimony. Each member for your service to our country, for your being courageous. I've listened very intently. And in listening, I started thinking about a number of members of the service, many who had served in the military, and have had conversation with several Gold Star family members who lost individuals, lost family members in Afghanistan. And I began to think then, what is the one real question that I have, and I want to address it. I guess I'll address it to you, Peter, and then to you, Lieutenant Colonel Mann. The one decision that I know that the President of the United States made was to stop the war in Afghanistan, to leave, to exit. So, Mr. Lucier, the question is, should the President have made the decision to exit the war in Afghanistan, in your opinion?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Ranking Member. And Lucifer happens all the time, especially with, back in the day when we used to get, telemarketers on the landline. So it's a good question. It's a difficult one. It's one that I struggle with. Prior to all this, I took actions and spoke to some members of Congress here today about how I felt about how the war had been conducted and where we ought to go. Should we have stayed in Afghanistan? Strictly in my personal opinion and experiences, that war was a frustrating one in 2011. Conducting counterinsurgency operations felt vague, without direction. So it was difficult, and seeing the violence and the lives lost and the friends I lost during that conflict and then after, it's tough. Ultimately, that's not my decision to make. I'm not sure that I have the right answer. Afghanistan was incredibly complex. It's surrounded by regional partners. There's nuclear folks in the region. It's hard. Making those decisions is hard, and that's what we ask our elected leaders to do. Congressional oversight was lacking for 20 years of war. Budgets were passed year after year with little examination of how the war was going. So there was little pressure for the way that we were conducting the war to change. So it's a good question, but ultimately the work that I do as an advocate and with the organizations that I do is focused on helping those left behind. We can't change that decision, but there's a lot of people on my list who are trying to get here, and there's lots of things that we could do to help them that aren't being done. So
I want to get to that because we've got to talk about all sort of things that we can do. But I do want to give Lieutenant Colonel Mann an opportunity because I think that's a fundamental issue. I know, as I said, we lost 2,461 Americans, including the 13 that were killed, all of which, each and every one of them breaks my heart. But I know I had difficulty in talking to some, even before the evacuation, as to what are we doing there. And ultimately, the President had to make a decision. Either we stay, as the prior administrations had to make a decision. President Trump, President Obama, these other they had to make a decision. Do we escalate or do we not? And that's something that a commander-in-chief has to decide. But I guess each of us may have our own personal opinions. What's yours?
I appreciate the opportunity to answer that question, Ranking Member Meeks, and I would just say, like Pete, it's I'm not a policy guy, but what I will say is as a career special forces officer who spent a good amount of time in Afghanistan helping to build capacity for the Afghan security forces to be an antibody to violent extremist groups so that we didn't have to do it. That was, for special forces, the community, that was something very near and dear to our hearts, especially when what happened on 9/11 pointed so directly to the absence of a ground intelligence capability and a viable partner force. And so we fought and we bled for 20 years to build an Afghan special operations forces capacity. And while I know the meta-narrative is that the security forces withdrew, didn't fight, the reality is the Afghan special ops did 95% of the fighting and fought to the very end. Most of them ran out of bullets. Many of them were overrun. And so my point on that is I believe that could have been a responsible antibody to violent extremist groups with a small footprint that do advise and assist. And I believe that we could have maintained that. But instead, we allowed the contract air to go away and all of the maintenance. They were left without any air support, any medevac, and they were not able to do what special operators are great at doing. So I believe that they could have stayed in an advisory capacity. And now what we're left with is 27 violent extremist groups on the rise, unfettered safe haven, and only the National Resistance Front as the antibody to it and nothing else.
I had to follow up, but I know I'm out of time, so I'll yield back.
Chair